It began without warning. At 10:01 p.m., the first missile struck, its roar shaking the heavens. It wasn't the flash of light that first signaled the end, but the sound, the deep, ominous rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The kind of sound you hear in a dream, when you're not quite sure whether it's real or whether it's something your subconscious has conjured in its darkest hour. But this was real. The explosion obliterated the skyline. Buildings that had withstood centuries of human history crumbled in an instant. Glass, steel, concrete, everything that had been built to stand the test of time was reduced to nothing. In New York, the impact felt like the end of the world. The first wave hit with such force that it shattered the very fabric of civilization. The once bustling streets, filled with millions of people, were now a war zone, strewn with debris and charred bodies. The city that had always stood as a symbol of human achievement, of progress, of freedom, of strength, was gone. The Empire State Building, once a proud testament to ambition and the ingenuity of man, had been reduced to rubble. Its towering spire, which had reached far into the sky, now lay at the foot of what had once been Fifth Avenue. The city was no longer a place of dreams. It was a tomb. Across the world, the same fate befell other iconic cities. Moscow's Red Square was nothing but a crater, the once imposing Kremlin reduced to a pile of stone. The streets of London, filled with the hum of life just moments before, were now rivers of fire. Big Ben's clock, which had been ticking for centuries, had stopped. And in Tokyo, the ancient city built on the delicate balance between tradition and modernity had disappeared beneath the blinding light of the explosion, its soul consumed by the heat and fury of war. At 10:03 p.m., the shockwaves spread like ripples on water. They didn't just devastate the cities, but the infrastructure of the world itself. Satellites in orbit flickered, their signals lost. Radio towers fell silent. The global communications network collapsed in real time, and with it, any hope of organizing a response. The world had gone dark, and no one knew who had fired the first shot. No one knew what had sparked the firestorm. The few survivors who were still conscious could only watch as the world they knew was unmade in front of their eyes. They didn't understand what had happened. They didn't understand why it had happened. What they knew was that the war had begun, and with it, the death of a civilization. Governments failed to react. The military response, though swift, was ineffective. The moment the first missile struck, the balance of power had already shifted. No nation was spared. No safe place existed. The bombs didn't care about borders. They didn't care about alliances. They didn't care about anything except spreading destruction. At 10:05 p.m., as the dust settled over the ruins of once great cities, a new world began to take shape. A world where the old systems no longer held any power. The world's financial markets, once a symbol of stability, were gone. The stock exchanges in New York, London, and Tokyo all ceased to function. Money was no longer valuable. Resources were all that mattered now. The very air had changed. Toxic fumes from the explosions began to fill the atmosphere, mixing with the smoke from burning buildings. The world's oceans began to churn as naval fleets were destroyed, sunk by waves of destruction. The environmental toll of the war was immediate and catastrophic. The first bomb had not only destroyed cities, it had laid the foundation for the collapse of everything. The war had turned the clock back, in a matter of minutes, to an age where survival itself would be the only goal. At 10:10 p.m. The initial blast was only the beginning. In its wake, the world's infrastructure began to unravel, thread by thread. Entire economies were erased. Military forces were decimated. The energy grids, once the veins of industrialized nations, were gone, plunging vast swaths of the world into a silent, oppressive darkness. The global order that had been built over centuries of diplomacy, war, and trade had vanished in less than 10 minutes. In the rubble of New York, the streets were littered with broken glass and twisted steel. The Empire State Building had been reduced to a smoking ruin. The once bustling streets of Manhattan were unrecognizable, a tangled mess of debris, fires, and the remnants of human civilization. The city's famed yellow taxis, symbols of commerce and movement, lay upside down, burning in the streets. The iconic skyline, once a symbol of global power, was nothing but a smoldering wasteland. Moscow, too, was in ruins. The Kremlin's once proud walls were nothing more than charred remnants. The sounds of combat echoed in the distance as survivors scattered into underground bunkers. But the truth was undeniable. The heart of Russia had been gutted. The city that had once been the center of Soviet power, and later a symbol of the Russian Federation's resurgence, was now a shadow of its former self. Across the oceans, London was burning. The Thames River, which had once flowed serenely through the heart of the city, now carried the debris of destroyed buildings. Big Ben's iconic bell, once a symbol of time's unyielding passage, had fallen silent. The British Parliament, a centuries-old institution, had been leveled. The Whitehall district, once home to political power, was reduced to rubble. The city's famed double-decker buses, once icons of the city's rhythm, now lay abandoned in streets choked with smoke and ash. In the skies, the destruction was equally devastating. Commercial aircraft that had once soared effortlessly across the globe now lay in pieces, scattered like broken toys. Military jets had been shot down, their pilots nowhere to be found. The global transport system, the backbone of trade and diplomacy, had ground to a halt. There was no one left to coordinate the world's supply chains, no one to manage the global economy. The systems that had once connected the world were no more. As the bombs continued to rain down, one after another, the world's cities were transformed into graveyards. The human race, which had spent centuries building empires, advancing technologies, and crafting civilizations, was now confronted with the brutal reality of its fragility. The world had not prepared for this. The weapons had been tested, but never expected to be used on such a scale. The war had been unleashed, and there was no turning back. At 10:15 p.m., the collapse of the modern world wasn't just physical, it was psychological. As the bombings continued, the very notion of civilization began to erode. People who had once relied on technology, on the conveniences of modern life, were now forced to adapt to a world without the systems they had come to depend on. Electricity was a luxury. Running water was a distant memory. Communication with the outside world was impossible. The global political system had already fallen apart. In the wake of the attacks, leaders had disappeared. The United Nations, once a symbol of international diplomacy, had no power to stop the bloodshed. Governments, once the backbone of societies, were nothing but ashes. There were no longer any clear lines on the map, no more alliances, no more treaties. The world was now a fractured, divided chaos. What remained was not civilization, but its remnants. broken and battered, fighting for scraps. Survival had become the only thing that mattered. People would no longer be governed by laws, but by their ability to survive in the face of unimaginable destruction. At 10:20 p.m., the bombs kept falling. The world had been divided into two types of places: those that had been destroyed and those that were about to be. The environment itself had begun to decay. Fires raged uncontrolled, flooding cities and forests with toxic smoke. The seas were tainted by oil spills, and the air was thick with poisonous gases. The earth itself seemed to be reacting to the war, as if it too was suffering from the wounds inflicted by humanity. And so, as the first hour of World War III continued to unfold, the survivors, those few who were still alive, faced the brutal truth. There was no future, only the ruins of the past. And what lay ahead was a fight for survival in a world that no longer resembled the one they had known. At 10:30 p.m., the world had gone dark, and it wasn't just the lights that were out. It was the very pulse of civilization that had vanished. The cities were already smoldering ruins, the iconic skylines of the world reduced to ash. But even more devastating was the disappearance of the systems that held everything together. The invisible threads that connected nations, economies, people, and cultures. First, the power grids failed. The infrastructure that once powered the world, the giant networks of electrical lines that fed entire continents, had crumbled in an instant. Cities that had once thrived with the hum of electricity were now plunged into total darkness. Even the moon was obscured by the thick clouds of smoke and dust, leaving the world in a perpetual, suffocating twilight. In the silence, the sound of destruction was replaced by the eerie emptiness of loss. Communications, once the lifeblood of modern civilization, were severed. The internet, that vast web of connections, had gone silent. Websites, social media platforms, news outlets, everything that had once connected people, provided information, and held societies together, had simply disappeared. In the wake of the bombing, all digital infrastructure was wiped out. Telecommunications satellites, once gliding effortlessly above the Earth, had been knocked from their orbits by the shockwaves. The global network that allowed messages to travel instantly across vast distances had vanished. The airwaves were now empty, static, buzzing in place of voices that used to inform, educate, and entertain. The world was alone, isolated. No one knew what had happened in the other countries. No one knew where the attacks had come from, or who had survived. The silence was deafening. At 10:35 p.m., the collapse of communication wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a death knell for society itself. Without the internet, nations could no longer coordinate. The military, once the defenders of sovereignty, now found themselves scattered, cut off from one another, unable to respond to the rapidly deteriorating situation. Political leaders, who had spent years negotiating treaties, crafting policies, and managing complex international relations, now had no means of speaking to one another. It was as if the world had been disassembled piece by piece, leaving only fragments behind. The financial systems built on the quick exchange of information had also collapsed. Stock markets were already crashing before the bombs had even fallen. With the communications infrastructure wiped out, the collapse of global currencies was assured. The once mighty banks that controlled the flow of wealth around the world had fallen silent, their vaults empty, their assets frozen in time. What was once valuable, money, gold, oil, had lost all meaning. Without systems to facilitate trade, resources were now worthless unless one could hold them in hand. Without any way to check the facts or reach out to other governments, panic took hold of the survivors. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed the attack had been orchestrated by a rogue state. Others speculated that a new kind of war had begun, one driven by the rage of the masses. No one knew for certain, and no one could provide answers. The uncertainty gnawed at people's minds, feeding the fear that already gripped them. At 10:40 p.m. In a world without connections, the struggle for survival became immediate. With every moment, the world's great cities, which had once functioned as hubs of culture, innovation, and wealth, began to rot from the inside out. The physical decay was inevitable. The fires that had broken out in every major city had already consumed most of the valuable resources. The banks were burned, the stores looted. What was left was simply the ruins of what had been. Without communication, the social fabric began to tear apart. The political systems, which had been built on laws and agreements, were now irrelevant. The world's ruling elites had no voice. They had no ability to command the resources they had once controlled. In the vacuum, the remnants of humanity, left without leadership or guidance, began to splinter. Nations, previously united by borders and treaties, had begun to fracture. The United States, once a world leader, was now broken into pieces. The government was gone, its structures shattered. The streets of Washington, D.C., once the beating heart of American power, were now empty, save for the occasional survivor roaming the rubble. Without communication, without coordination, the states were left to their own devices. Some tried to hold on to the illusion of order, but it was fleeting. In Europe, the European Union, a political and economic powerhouse, had no way to function. The borders, once designed to unite the nations of Europe, now served only to divide them further. Countries once bound by economic treaties and military alliances were now left to fight for scraps. The world's largest political and economic union had crumbled under the weight of the bombs. At 10:45 p.m., Asia, too, was in ruins. China, the most populous nation in the world, had suffered massive casualties. Its military, once the most powerful on Earth, was now broken and scattered. The sprawling cities of Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong had been reduced to rubble. With communication down, it was impossible to know how much of the country had survived. But the destruction was clear. There was no coordination, no leadership, no hope of rebuilding anytime soon. Even the Middle East, a region long embroiled in conflict, was not spared. In the wake of the attack, the fragile governments that had struggled to maintain control were gone. The oil fields, once the source of power for many nations, were now burning. The very resources that had fueled global conflict were now a smoldering reminder of humanity's folly. In the aftermath, it wasn't just the people who were lost. It was the systems they had relied on for so long. No longer could anyone call for help. No longer could anyone look to their leaders for direction. The structure of society had collapsed in an instant, and without communication, the world had become a patchwork of isolated pockets of survivors. At 10:50 p.m., without the systems that had once defined them, the people of the world were left with nothing but their raw instincts. Survival had become the only goal. It wasn't about rebuilding. There was no foundation left to rebuild upon. It wasn't about politics, leadership, or diplomacy. There was no one left to lead. What remained was simply the struggle to live through the next moment. The world was no longer connected. It was shattered into fragments, each one struggling to hold on in a world that had forgotten what it was to be whole. At 10:55 p.m. As the first hour of World War III continued to unfold, the global map, once a reflection of the carefully constructed political order, was now an abstract, fragmented puzzle. The bombs had done more than just destroy cities. They had obliterated the very fabric of international cooperation. The world's great political systems, built on decades of diplomacy, were now nothing more than relics of a bygone era. What had once been an intricate web of treaties, alliances, and coalitions now lay in tatters, scattered in the wake of annihilation. In the United States, the collapse of government was swift and total. The president, who had once been the face of the free world, was nowhere to be found. The Pentagon, the symbol of American military power, had been devastated by a direct hit, its command centers reduced to rubble. Military leadership, once so well coordinated and decisive, had fragmented. With communication systems severed, there was no way to order a coordinated defense. The National Guard units, scattered across the country, were left to fend for themselves, each state acting as an island unto itself. What had been a superpower was now a shattered nation. In the ruins of Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States lay in silent ruin. The White House, the symbol of American governance, had been leveled. The Supreme Court, the guardian of the Constitution, was gone. The United States had fallen, not with a whimper, but in a violent, chaotic explosion that had erased its political structure in an instant. The states, once united under a single flag, now splintered into isolated pockets, their fates uncertain, their connections to the outside world severed. Across the Atlantic, Europe had plunged into chaos. The European Union, once a symbol of unity and cooperation, was now a broken dream. The economic and political system that had bound together the nations of Europe had collapsed. Without communication, without the strength of a unified political force, the European nations had turned inward. Governments crumbled, and the very notion of a collective European identity was shattered. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, once the heart of the European project, were now fighting to survive on their own. No longer could they rely on the shared resources of the EU. Each country had to fend for itself, each struggling to secure food, water, and shelter in the aftermath of the devastation. The United Kingdom, too, was reeling. London had been obliterated by the same missiles that had struck its European neighbors. The British Parliament, the heart of British democracy, was no more. The country's leadership, once a central force in global politics, was nowhere to be found. The royal family, the symbol of continuity, had been swept away in the chaos. The British Isles, isolated geographically and now politically, faced an uncertain future. Would the nation survive? Would it fracture like the others? There were no answers, only the gnawing uncertainty of the present. In Russia, the collapse was no less severe. Moscow, the heart of the Russian Federation, had been hit hard by the same wave of destruction. The Kremlin, once the seat of power for Russia, was in ruins. The Russian military, once one of the largest and most powerful in the world, was now scattered and broken. The central government had disintegrated. No one knew who was in charge, or even if there was anyone left to lead. In the absence of leadership, Survival became the only priority. The Russian Federation had fractured into regional pockets of power, each one struggling for control over the country's vast resources. China, too, had been devastated. The explosions had struck with a ferocity that left the country reeling. Beijing, once the center of Chinese political and economic power, had been torn apart. The Chinese Communist Party, which had controlled the nation for decades, was now fractured. The military, though large, was no longer a cohesive force. Without communications, coordination was impossible. The chaos had spread throughout the country, leaving the once tightly controlled Chinese state in disarray. The central government had crumbled, and what was left was a fractured nation, its people fighting for survival amid the ruins. In the Middle East, the story was no different. The fragile political systems of the region had collapsed under the weight of the attack. The oil-rich nations of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq had been hit hard. Their economies, once dependent on the steady flow of oil, were in ruins. The explosions had not just destroyed the cities, they had obliterated the very infrastructure that sustained life in the region. The great oil fields, which had fueled both prosperity and conflict for decades, were now burning. The rich, the powerful, and the desperate all sought to control what little was left. But in the vacuum of power, violence ruled. No central government existed anymore. The region was a patchwork of factions, each fighting to survive, with no hope of returning to the political status quo. At 10:58 p.m., the destruction was not just physical, it was psychological. The collapse of political systems and governments shattered the illusion of stability that had once defined the modern world. Nations that had once been united in the pursuit of progress, prosperity, and peace were now fighting for their very survival. What had once been a planet of nations, each with its own power, wealth, and influence, was now a collection of fractured remnants, each struggling to hold on to what little they had left. Without leaders, without a collective sense of purpose, the survivors were left to fend for themselves. International cooperation, which had been the hallmark of modern civilization, was gone. The United Nations, which had once been the mediator of global disputes, was powerless in the face of the chaos. The treaties and agreements that had bound the nations together were meaningless. The world had become a battlefield where survival was the only rule. The very concept of global unity had crumbled. No longer were nations allies in the fight for progress. Now, they were just competing for survival, each fighting to preserve what little they had left. The global community had fractured, and with it, any hope for the future. At 11 p.m., the first hour of World War III was drawing to a close. What remained was not a world of interconnected nations, but a world of isolated territories, each fighting to stay alive. The political structures that had once defined the planet were gone, and in their place a brutal, chaotic new world was emerging, one where survival was the only thing that mattered. The war was not just a battle for territory, it was a battle for the very soul of humanity. The first hour of World War III had brought not only destruction, but an irreversible transformation of the planet itself. What had once been thriving, bustling cities, symbols of human achievement, were now nothing more than charred remains. The aftermath of the bombs was not just the crumbling of infrastructure. It was the slow, agonizing decay of the very environment that had supported human life for centuries. In New York, the streets that had once been teeming with life were now deserted and hauntingly still. The Empire State Building, a symbol of human ambition, lay in ruins, its shattered spire a sad reminder of what had been lost. The skyscrapers that had once scraped the sky were now rubble, their steel frames twisted and contorted by the force of the explosions. The sounds of human life, cars honking, people chatting, the rush of the city, had been replaced by the low hum of fires consuming what little remained. The streets were covered in debris, the once pristine sidewalks now cracked and broken, strewn with the remnants of cars and structures that had been torn apart. The famous yellow taxis, once a symbol of New York's constant motion, now lay overturned, burning in the middle of streets that were no longer passable. The subway tunnels meant to shelter millions from the chaos above had become death traps, their entrances sealed with the rubble of collapsing buildings. Those who had sought refuge there were now trapped in a dark, suffocating maze, unable to escape the poison in the air or the collapse of the very ground beneath them. Across the Atlantic, London had suffered a similar fate. The Thames, once a serene and life-giving river, had turned black with soot and ash. The iconic bridges that had once connected the city's heart were now twisted wrecks, their iron and stone structures barely clinging to existence. Big Ben's bell had fallen silent, its iconic chime no longer echoing through the streets. The city, known for its resilience and spirit, had been flattened, its streets now filled with the detritus of a civilization that had come to a sudden and brutal halt. The fires that raged through London, Paris, and other major cities were not merely destructive. They were apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods, once filled with life, had been reduced to ashes. What had once been homes were now little more than piles of rubble, their inhabitants lost to the unrelenting heat. The sky, once a symbol of the future, had become a choking mass of smoke and ash, blocking out the sun. Day and night had become indistinguishable, and in the oppressive heat, even the air seemed to burn. As the destruction spread, it was clear that the environmental toll was beyond anything humanity had ever faced. The air itself was thick with toxic fumes, the result of burning buildings, chemicals, and the destruction of industrial sites. What had once been fresh, breathable air was now laden with poison. In the immediate wake of the explosions, the ozone layer had been further eroded, allowing the deadly ultraviolet rays of the sun to reach the earth unfiltered. What had once been a protective atmosphere was now a sieve, and the consequences were catastrophic. The seas, too, had been polluted by the fallout of war. Oil rigs had been destroyed, spilling their contents into the oceans, turning the waters into a toxic soup. Fish and marine life, once the sustenance of millions, were now dying at an unprecedented rate. The oceans that had once sustained the world's economies and provided food for billions were now a poisoned wasteland. The very life force of the planet was being suffocated beneath the ash and debris of humanity's hubris. What had once been vibrant forests were now burning at an uncontrollable pace. The trees that had stood for centuries, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of civilizations, were reduced to nothing more than blackened stumps, their roots choked by the flames. The loss of these forests was not just a loss of beauty, it was a loss of vital ecosystems that had supported life on Earth. The plants, the animals, the insects, all were caught in the global inferno. In the midst of this chaos, the Earth itself seemed to be crying out, as if it too were suffering under the weight of mankind's destruction. The environmental collapse was as swift as it was devastating. It was not just the cities that had burned. but the very ecosystems that had sustained humanity for millennia. The air, the seas, the land, all were now in the process of decay. The question that lingered heavy and unspoken was whether the Earth could ever recover from such devastation. Could life in any form survive the consequences of World War III? The survivors, those few who had managed to escape the initial bombings, now found themselves in a world they no longer recognized. The cities were lost. The environment was collapsing. The air they breathed was toxic. The food they relied on was gone. And the waters that once provided sustenance were now undrinkable. The world had become a place of struggle, of desperation, where survival had become the only priority. As the fires raged on, and the earth continued to suffer under the weight of the war, one thing became painfully clear. The world that had existed before was gone. What remained was a fractured planet, struggling to stay alive. The survivors, if they could still be called that, were now faced with a question that had no answer. How do you survive in a world that no longer seems to want you? The devastation was not just a matter of infrastructure, resources, or the environment. It was, most tragically, the countless lives lost in the immediate aftermath of World War III. In the blink of an eye, entire cities, once teeming with millions of people, had been erased from existence. The very fabric of civilization, the beating heart of humanity, was now nothing but a pile of rubble, and with it, the lives of hundreds of millions of individuals. The war had claimed more than just land or power. It had claimed the future itself. The toll of human life was unfathomable. Across the world, the explosions that had leveled New York, Moscow, Beijing, London, and other global cities had wiped out entire populations in mere moments. In the aftermath, the death toll was counted in the hundreds of millions, and the true scope of the devastation was still unknown. The cities that had once represented humanity's greatest achievements, New York, Tokyo, Paris, Berlin, Mumbai, were now reduced to nothing more than graveyards. There were no survivors to tell the tales, no families to mourn together. The silence was deafening. In New York, the epicenter of American commerce and culture, the population had been in the millions. That number, once so large it felt invulnerable, was now reduced to an incomprehensible number. The explosion that decimated the heart of the city left nothing behind but ashes. The streets, filled with people going about their daily routines, were now void of life. Where once the hustle and bustle of the city had given rise to dreams, now there was only the absence of hope. The survivors, those few who had managed to escape the inferno, would be forever haunted by the memories of what was lost in that one devastating moment. But even for them, the number of lives lost was staggering. Moscow, the heart of Russia, had suffered a similar fate. The Kremlin, once a symbol of Russian power and history, was now a pile of smoking rubble. The city's population, which had numbered in the millions, had been wiped out in an instant. The blast that had torn through the heart of the city had not just obliterated buildings. It had taken with it generations of history, families, traditions. Russia, a land that had borne witness to centuries of struggle, had lost not only its political leadership, but a vast swath of its people. Across Europe, the situation was no different. London, once the proud center of the British Empire, was now little more than a crater. The population of the United Kingdom, once a sprawling and diverse community, had been cut down by the bombings. The same story played out in Paris, Berlin, Rome, once thriving centers of culture, art, and politics. now eerily silent. The streets were filled with the ghosts of a civilization that no longer existed. The question of how many lives had been lost, how many had been buried beneath the ruins, was one that would never have an answer. The numbers were too great, the scale too incomprehensible. China, too, had been decimated. Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, metropolises that had represented the future of global power, had been reduced to ashes. The Chinese population, the largest on Earth, had borne the brunt of the war. While the true numbers were impossible to confirm, estimates suggested that hundreds of millions had perished in the blast zones alone. Entire families, entire communities, had vanished in an instant. The ancient civilization that had persevered through centuries of turmoil had now witnessed the complete collapse of its modern identity. In the Middle East, the devastation was no less severe. The oil-rich nations of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq had seen their major cities engulfed in flames. The Middle East, a region already fraught with conflict, had now borne the brunt of a war that knew no mercy. The loss of life here was staggering. Families, once thriving in the deserts and mountains, had been wiped out by the explosions. Entire nations had been erased from the map, their people lost to the inferno. In the cities of Cairo, Dubai, and Tehran, the once vibrant streets were now empty, and the lives of millions had been snuffed out in the blink of an eye. The global death toll was staggering. Hundreds of millions were dead. Yet even that was a conservative estimate, for how could anyone ever truly account for the loss? The immediate casualties were incalculable, but the long-term effects would be felt for generations. The survivors, those few who had managed to escape the bombings, would be left to live in a world that could never again be the same. Entire generations were lost in that 1 hour of violence. The elderly, the young, the sick, none had been spared. It was as if humanity had been struck down in its prime. But the true horror of this loss was not just in the numbers. It was in the absence of those lives. The families that had been torn apart. The communities that had been erased. The stories that would never be told. The generations of history, culture, knowledge, and experience that had once made up the fabric of civilization were now lost. In the destruction of the world's cities, the world's greatest achievements were erased. The people who had built those cities, who had filled them with life and innovation, were gone. And with them the future. The survivors, if they could even be called that, would have to carry the weight of this loss. They would live in a world where nothing could ever replace what had been taken from them. The survivors of World War III, those few who managed to escape the initial wave of destruction, were left to walk through the ruins of their former lives. The world had been emptied of its spirit, and those who remained were left to pick through the ashes. There would be no monuments to honor the dead. There would be no ceremonies or commemorations. The only thing left was the struggle to survive. But how could one survive in a world where everything that had made life worth living was gone? The cities, the cultures, the achievements, everything had been reduced to ash. The world that had once been was now nothing but a memory. And that memory was all that the survivors had left. In the wake of World War III's first hour, there was no clear divide between before and after. There was only a timeless, perpetual sense of loss. The earth was silent, save for the occasional groan of collapsing infrastructure, the crackle of distant fires, and the eerie hum of a world struggling to breathe under the weight of its own destruction. The natural sounds of life, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the hum of human activity had all been drowned out by the profound stillness that now covered the planet. The silence was as suffocating as the smoke and ash that now filled the air. The emotional and psychological toll on humanity was incalculable. No words could describe the anguish that rippled through the survivors, the disbelief, the shock, the overwhelming sense of emptiness. How do you process the loss of so much in such a short amount of time? How do you comprehend a world in which everything familiar has been wiped away? There were no answers, only the hollow echo of a world that no longer existed. In the shattered remains of the cities, survivors wandered like ghosts, disoriented and numb. They stumbled through streets they once knew by heart, now unrecognizable in their ruin. What had been vibrant neighborhoods filled with bustling markets, children's laughter, and the hum of commerce was now a landscape of ruin. The familiar had turned foreign, the places they had called home now strange, threatening, and filled with danger. The trauma wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The survivors, if they could still be called that, carried with them the psychological scars of what they had endured. Families had been torn apart in an instant. Children had lost parents. Parents had lost children. Loved ones had vanished in the blink of an eye. And there was no time to grieve. There was no time for closure, no ceremony, no opportunity to say goodbye. The cruelest part of the war was that, in the chaos, there was no way to know who was lost and who remained. People called out for each other in the streets, their voices hoarse from the smoke, but there was no response. No one was coming back. The brokenness of the world was reflected in the faces of those who survived. They wore their grief like a heavy cloak, a weight that was as suffocating as the toxic air they breathed. The trauma would stay with them, long after the ashes had settled. And yet, there was no time for reflection. There was only the raw instinct to survive, to move forward in a world where nothing made sense. Humanity's understanding of itself, its identity, and its place in the world had been shattered. The social structures that once governed daily life, the institutions, the laws, the relationships, had all but collapsed. Governments once thought to be the bedrock of civilization were now dust. Military forces, the protectors of nations, were scattered and broken. The once strong infrastructure that held societies together had crumbled in an instant, leaving people to fend for themselves. In the absence of leadership and law, chaos reigned. Social order, once taken for granted, had evaporated. What was left was the raw, primal urge to survive. Communities fractured, and the survivors turned against each other in their desperation. The concept of trust, once the cornerstone of human society, was now a distant memory. People, once bound together by shared experiences and mutual understanding, now looked at each other with suspicion and fear. With no central authority to maintain order, the survivors of World War III quickly turned into fractured groups, fighting for whatever resources they could find. Food, water, and shelter, once readily available, were now luxuries that had to be fought for. The desperation to survive led to violence. Small, isolated communities clashed over supplies, and larger, more organized groups sought to dominate others, using force to claim what they could. The brutality of this new world was a direct result of the loss of everything that had once held civilization together. What remained was a harsh, unforgiving environment where survival was the only rule. The violence, born of necessity, was compounded by the psychological toll of the war. The survivors, living in the aftermath of such an apocalyptic event, were forever changed. The grief, the horror, the shock, they could never be undone. The world that had once been vibrant, full of hope and possibility, was now a world filled with uncertainty and dread. Even in the rare moments when survivors would gather in small groups, there was no joy. There were no stories of resilience or triumph. There was only the shared knowledge that everything had been lost. Nations that had once been divided by political ideologies and borders now found themselves united in their suffering. The war had leveled everything, from the most advanced military nations to the poorest and most war-torn regions of the world. There were no winners in this conflict, only survivors, and they were left to grapple with a reality in which nothing was certain. The idea of global unity, once an ideal, had dissolved in the fires of war. People once divided by nationality, race, and religion now had to confront their shared humanity in the face of overwhelming destruction. But even in this collective suffering, there was no sense of solidarity. There was only fear, distrust, and the urge to survive at all costs. In the heart of the cities, as the fires slowly burned themselves out and the smoke began to settle, there was a sense that the world had been irrevocably changed. Civilization, as it had been known, was gone. The ruins of the world's greatest cities were now nothing but monuments to human folly. And as the survivors picked through the wreckage, one question echoed through their minds. Was there anything left worth saving? In the days to come, humanity would be forced to rebuild. But what would that world look like? Would it be a world of survival, driven by the need to stay alive in a fractured, chaotic landscape? Or would it be a world defined by something more? The survivors were left to wrestle with these questions in a world that had become unrecognizable, unsure of how to move forward in the wake of such overwhelming destruction. The earth itself seemed to recoil in terror as the war's true consequences unfolded. The weight of devastation had long since moved beyond the political, the environmental, or the economic. What remained was something far more primitive and far more devastating, an unraveling of the human spirit itself. The psychological and emotional fracture of humanity was now in full view, laid bare in every shattered city, every silent horizon, every broken voice that whispered through the ruins. What persisted wasn't just a battle for survival. It was the desperate, fading struggle to hold on to something, anything, that could still be called civilization. Across the remnants of the planet, survivors wandered through apocalyptic streets like ghosts trapped in their own world, eyes hollow from the things they had witnessed, bodies weak from starvation and radiation, minds fractured by a trauma too immense to comprehend. They moved without direction, without purpose, without hope, drifting through the ashes of what once was. What had once been familiar was now unrecognizable, warped beyond memory by fire, shockwaves, and collapse. Neighborhoods dissolved into scorched wastelands. Skylines that once defined nations crumbled into jagged skeletons of steel and stone. The cities humanity had spent centuries building, the institutions they had trusted to preserve stability, the societies they had carefully constructed, were all wiped away in mere moments of unrestrained destruction. There was no governance, no law, no structure. Only chaos left to pulse through the veins of a dying world. Nations no longer existed in any meaningful sense, just scattered pockets of humanity clinging to survival like flickering flames in a storm that refused to end. The systems people once believed in, the justice they relied upon, The order they expected, the progress they celebrated, had collapsed into dust, leaving an empty void where certainty used to live. Communication lines had fallen silent. Borders had dissolved into wastelands. The maps that once guided humanity held no meaning anymore. They were relics of a world that no longer existed. Every step survivors took was a reminder that nothing remained to protect them, guide them, or save them. The earth was no longer a home but a graveyard, vast, cold, and indifferent. And through this desolation, the unmistakable truth echoed louder than every explosion, louder than every scream that had come before. The war had not merely destroyed nations, it had destroyed the very idea of humanity. In the void that followed, it became every person for themselves. The fragile threads that once connected societies had snapped, leaving nothing but isolation in their wake. In cities once filled with the hum of progress, all that remained were faint echoes, ghostly reminders of what had been. Streets that once overflowed with ambition, laughter, and purpose now lay silent beneath layers of ash and debris. Towers that had symbolized human achievement had been reduced to cold, twisted metal. The survivors wandered these ruins like strangers in a world that no longer belonged to them, lost in landscapes that had erased everything they had ever known. Civilization, so carefully constructed over millennia, had crumbled in a matter of hours. It wasn't simply a loss of infrastructure or technology, it was the annihilation of meaning itself. The systems that once shaped identity, the cultures that defined communities, the roles that gave individuals purpose, all had been obliterated. People no longer had nations, professions, or futures. They had only their next breath, their next step, their next desperate decision. The collapse was not merely physical. It tore through the emotional and psychological core of humanity, leaving behind a raw and aching emptiness. Without the bonds that had once held nations together, survivors were forced to stare directly into the void that had been hidden beneath centuries of structure and stability. The war had stripped away every illusion that once offered comfort. Progress, security, hope, concepts once spoken with conviction, now felt like distant fantasies in the face of overwhelming destruction. Promises that leaders, institutions, and societies had repeated for generations now rang hollow, swallowed by the silence of a broken world. Every shattered building, every abandoned street, every burned horizon whispered the same truth. Humanity had believed itself capable of greatness, yet it had proven far more capable of devastation. And in the aftermath, the survivors were left to grapple with questions that cut deeper than hunger or fear. If humanity could build so much, monuments, cities, technologies, entire civilizations, only to destroy it all in an instant, then what meaning did those achievements truly hold? What was the point of rebuilding, of trying again, when everything they created could be erased by a single moment of rage, arrogance, or desperation? The survivors stood at the crossroads between what remained and what had been lost, unsure whether to cling to the remnants of the past or surrender to the brutal, unforgiving reality before them. And in that emptiness, one chilling thought lingered. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the war was not that humanity had destroyed the world, but that it had destroyed its faith in itself. In the destroyed remains of what had once been the great cities, people gathered, not out of unity, not out of shared resilience, but out of sheer desperation. There was no comfort in numbers anymore, no reassurance in being among others. The bonds of trust, of community, of kinship, those fragile threads that had once held societies together, had eroded almost immediately in the face of catastrophe. Every person had become an island unto themselves, clutching at whatever scraps of security or shelter they could scavenge from the ruins. Humanity, once so proud of its collective strength, had descended into a raw, primal struggle where survival outweighed compassion. Food was scarce, water was poisoned, and every sunrise marked the beginning of another battle, not just against the elements, but against each other. People who once worked side by side now watched one another with suspicion, ready to defend the last can of food or the final clean drop of water with lethal force. The strongest thrived, the weak, the sick, the unlucky. They perished swiftly, swallowed by the merciless environment, or by those who had decided that surviving one more day outweighed any moral code. And yet, even those who lived were haunted by something far heavier than hunger or fear, the crushing realization that nothing would ever return to what it once was. Humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. What had once been bustling neighborhoods in New York and London were now unrecognizable wastelands. Streets that once thrummed with the rhythm of life were choked with rubble, wreckage, and the quiet stillness of abandonment. The skylines, those proud monuments to human ambition, stood broken and twisted, jagged silhouettes against a sun that no longer felt warm or welcoming. Its light seemed almost too bright, too harsh, casting long, distorted shadows over landscapes of ruin. It illuminated nothing but devastation, as though the world itself was being exposed under a merciless spotlight. The skies had changed too. They hung heavy in sickly shades of yellow and gray, swirling with dust, smoke, and the lingering scars of nuclear fire. It felt as though even the heavens were mourning, as if the atmosphere itself carried the grief of a planet that had watched its children tear it apart. Every breath tasted of metal, ash, and decay. Every gust of wind whispered not life, but loss. The earth had become an inhospitable place, a wounded organism struggling to sustain anything that dared to remain upon it. Storms came without warning. Radiation pockets drifted unpredictably, and temperatures swung between extremes that defied logic. The survivors had no choice but to adapt, to harden themselves, to carve a semblance of existence out of the chaos. But adaptation came with a cost. It demanded the abandonment of softness, of empathy, of the very traits that had once defined humanity. Every day that passed felt like a slow unraveling of what it meant to be human. Compassion became a liability. Hope became a burden. Memory became a curse. The world that had once celebrated progress, innovation, and unity was now gone, replaced by a bleak, unforgiving reality where survival meant becoming something colder, tougher, and far less recognizable. Humanity had survived the end of the world, but it had not survived unchanged. In the East, cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Mumbai were nothing more than memories. Entire nations that had once been giants of progress, of economic power, had been brought to their knees. What was left were the echoes of their former grandeur, ruins that spoke only of the destructive force that had leveled them. And with the fall of these powerhouses, the global economy had collapsed entirely. There was no longer a market to buy or sell from. Trade was dead. What was once valued had become worthless in the wake of destruction. The survivors in these regions were left without the framework of modern society. They knew how to survive, but they no longer knew how to live. With every passing day, the desperation grew. There were no more governments to give guidance, no more leaders to provide hope. The survivors had no choice but to turn inward, focusing on their immediate needs, on the present. And yet, they couldn't escape the gnawing sense that humanity had failed itself. The collapse wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Meanwhile, the environment continued its slow death. The fires that had scorched the earth burned on, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Entire forests, once the lungs of the planet, had been consumed in flames. The oceans, once so full of life, had become a toxic wasteland. The waters that had once nurtured billions of people were now thick with oil, chemicals, and the corpses of marine life. Fish floated to the surface in bloated heaps, a grim testament to the scale of the devastation. The skies were dark, perpetually clouded by the ash that had risen from the ruins. What was once a life-giving atmosphere was now a death sentence. The air was thick with smoke and toxins. Every breath felt like inhaling death itself. And the earth, for its part, seemed to be recoiling from the violence that had been visited upon it. Climate patterns had gone haywire. In some places, the heat was unbearable. In others, it was freezing cold. The seasons themselves seemed to have lost their rhythm, as if the planet could no longer keep time. And in the midst of all this, the survivors were left to wonder, how much more could humanity endure? The physical, emotional, and psychological toll had already been immeasurable. They were living in a world that no longer resembled the one they had known, and yet there was no way to return to what had been. The war had not just destroyed cities, it had destroyed civilization itself. In this new world, there were no heroes. There was no glory to be found. What remained was survival. But even that came at a cost. The survivors, the few who had managed to cling to life, were left to face a world that had no place for them. They had no purpose except to endure. And even that was uncertain. The earth, the planet they had once called home, had been ravaged by their greed, their violence, their apathy. The war was the culmination of everything humanity had built and destroyed over the centuries. It was a reflection of the darkest parts of themselves, the parts they had never confronted. And now, in the ruins of their own making, they had to live with the consequences. There was no coming back from this. There would be no rebuilding. The planet had been scarred beyond repair. Civilization had been erased. What was left was a world of chaos, where survival itself was the only thing that mattered. Humanity had pushed the Earth to its breaking point, and in the end, it was the Earth that had won. As the survivors picked through the ashes, one question haunted them all. What had it all been for?